politicians couldn't wait to shake each calloused hand by the midnight factory gate, praising the working woman and man who will speak for me, who will speak for you, who will stand for me, who will stand for you.
Hi, this is Marjohn Love, and this is Marjohn's Musings. And today's show is Violation of Expectations. I had kind of a tough time coming up with the theme for today's show. I was grappling with several different ideas. When I used to work locked unit mental health back in Philadelphia, there were two diagnoses: tangential thinking and over-inclusive thinking, that were applied to people who had paranoid ideations or were manic. But those same two traits of being able to go down one path and veer off and see something else and bring it back and go down the path and veer off and hear something and bring it in and go down the path and feel something and bring it back in is what helps make creative genius. And the ability to include more ideas than people expect, to be able to take disparate pieces of information and bring them together, is what makes commentators interesting, makes people tune in to certain shows or search the internet for different vlogs. I was thinking about the fact that our president talks a lot about fake news. And to tell you the truth, there's a lot of stuff on the internet which isn't true. And that's deeply disturbing. I don't think that we can go back to the days of Walter Cronkite, the fatherly figure who tells us what's going on in the world with Danny DeVito, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts approach. But even in those days, there's an editing that happens as you decide what you'll present and how. Today's show I wanted to do on why the youth in America and people of certain ethnic origins and people of color are in such dire straits financially. And it brought me to the banking industry. And I did some research. Now, I'm not the kind of person that you would want to get your news from. My show isn't about bringing you timely facts, although I do sometimes. That's not the focus of this show. But in doing research on banks and the government, I found some deeply disturbing things. Our parents and grandparents of my generation lived through what was known as the Great Depression. It was horrible. People starved to death. There were lines blocks long for soup kitchens. So many people were out of work that it took an act of government to put people back to work under FDR and the New Deal. And because the crisis was caused by inappropriate banking and investment practices, There was a law put into effect in 1933, before I was even born, the Glass-Steagall Act. It regulated interest rates, and it developed the Federal Deposit Insurance, FDIC. Commercial banking, where you and I go to deposit our paychecks and set up our Christmas club and our vacation fund and our nest egg, that was separated by legal walls from investment banking in the 1936 Commodities Exchange Act. The commercial banks were not allowed to provide securities or insurance. They were separated out. And the reason was, if you are selling insurance, you can have a conflict of interest with the holder of the policy so that you wouldn't want to pay them if they had a fire or a flood or some other catastrophe. And with global warming, we're seeing a great many people lose their homes and or businesses to natural disasters, hurricanes, flash floods, forest fires. So 45 years after the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act, in 1978, usury laws were overturned. What's usury? It's kind of a weird old word. It means the charging of exorbitant rates of interest on debt. I can remember having a credit card and being angry when they raised my monthly credit percentage rate from 5 to 6. At that time, I had a savings account at 5% interest. I also had federal savings bonds at 12% interest. And I had certificates of deposit that were in double digits, 10, 11, 12%. So the money that I would owe on a mortgage, 5, 6, 7%, slowly grew over time until it was 19, 20% with a balloon payment. And they extended the staircase of payback so that people could still get the loans and afford the loans from 20 to 30 years. I think the goal was to keep the population stable and in one place. If you own a home, you have a pride of place. Home ownership, if you don't mow the lawn, nobody else will. If you don't plant flowers, there won't be any. So if you own your own home, you're the one that has to take care of it. The sink breaks, you have to call the plumber. Your electric lights don't work, you have to call an electrician. Our rates of home ownership are declining. Why? With mortgage rates 3 and 4, 5%. Well, the industry has become so interwoven that banks are involved in real estate. And so real estate is no longer separated completely from banks to protect home buyers and homeowners. My home, which I got the mortgage for $90,000 23 years ago, is now valued at over $500,000. Same house, same postage stamp lot. The house is 1756. It's been paid off in terms of carpentry and masonry and plumbing for hundreds of years. Why would it cost so much? Well, taxation. We pay property tax. And the other houses on Mill Lane pay similar property tax. And yet, when we asked the government of Rockport to pave Mill Lane, they came in and filled 20 some odd potholes this year again. They did not invest the money to tear up the asphalt and repave our road, even though we all pay exorbitant property taxes. But we're the generation that owns homes. My son was looking for a home. He has a full-time job. He's a college graduate. He can't afford to buy a house. What's going on with that? Well, when the usury laws were overturned, and usury's been an issue since Bible days, there's one time in the Bible where Jesus really loses his temper and pitches people down the temple stairs and upends tables. Why? Well, at that time, the Romans occupied Judea, and if you got paid in Roman coin. But when you went to the temple to make offerings, like in the Catholic Church for generations, it was a tithe, a tenth of your income. And the Protestants reformed a whole lot of things, but they kept that part. So when you went to give either firstlings, a baby ram, a baby lamb, a baby steer, doves, different animals. You could bring animals, and then the rabbinate, the clergy, ate those animals. They cooked them up and ate them. So you could bring animals, or you could give coins, but they had to be Hebrew coins. And the people at the tables on the temple stairs were selling sacrificial animals at a handy profit. But the people at the money exchange tables were charging exorbitant exchange rates, which made Jesus angry because the money changers made much more money than the rabbis ministering to his people. It's one of the few times that he backs the powers that be. He didn't like the fact that these money changers were scalping people that wanted to go to the temple. In 1979, pension regulations were loosened, and they allowed speculation. That's gambling with other people's money, high-risk investments. And pensions across the country began to fail and were bought up in bankruptcy. I don't think that was just happenstance. I believe that was engineered, because shortly after the major pension funds started folding, employers used the folding of pension funds to not offer pensions to their workers. It was an enticement by companies for people to come and work for them. You work for us for 20, 25 years. At the end of that time, you will get a pension. But as American medical care became better and nutrition became better and people became aware of the benefits of exercise, people lived longer. They used to work until they were 65 and then dropped dead by 70. Well, people started working sooner, retired 25 years later, maybe at 50, and then lived until 80, 85. And the pension plan had to pay out every month, all those months. It was no longer lucrative. And so the people who owned pension funds got out of them one way or another. because they weren't making a lot of money, which was not what pensions were about. When I was a little girl, there were scandals of elderly widows whose husbands farmed or fished or were carpenters or plumbers or masons, so they did not work for someone else and deposit into Social Security. And when they died, their widow was left with whatever little savings they had accumulated. And after a couple of years, I can remember scandals about little old ladies buying cans of cat food, $3 a can for human tuna, and 3 cans of cat tuna for $1. And the little old ladies eating cat food. So we came up with Social Security so that elders didn't starve or become a burden to their middle-aged children who were raising children and were called the sandwich generation between the elders and the youth and then the grandbabies. They were swamped. And so they wanted elders to retain their independence. And we came up with Medicare, medical care for the elderly, and Social Security, and subsidized housing for elders. And then people said, wait a minute, this poor child was born with cerebral palsy, or this other young person contracted polio. They need to be taken care of too. And so we came up with supplemental security income. And as a country, we were Christian and Jewish and Muslim and Baha'i, and we were also atheist. And over the course of my lifetime, there's been a huge shift. But we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Because I want to stick with the fact that in 1982, there was a bill, Garn-St. Germain, the Depository Institution Act. It cost taxpayers $201 billion with a B, dollars. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow. At that time, these balloon payments on mortgages, people would pay in for 10 years and then have a balloon payment that real estate agents convinced them that, oh, you'll have a better job by then and you'll be able to make this balloon payment. And you should save every month, and then when the balloon payment comes due, you'll be able to pay it. Yeah, right. There was kind of a hiring and raise freeze to combat inflation. Inflation is a bad thing. It devalues the money so that your $3 can of tuna winds up costing $6. That's 100% inflation. And if you've got 20% inflation a year, in 5 years you've got 100% plus, because they add on. Each 20% adds on to the inflation of the year before. My grandmother could buy a loaf of bread for a nickel. My grandfather could buy a pack of cigarettes for a quarter and bemoan the fact that they used to be 12 cents. I was raised part of the time by my Catholic grandmother, and we tend to look for signs and portents. People say that makes us superstitious. But there's a trope in literature and movies, television shows, the devil's number. It's either 999 or 666. And the mythology is the devil doesn't know the difference between good and evil, but he's mean. And so he can't read B's from D's, P's from Q's. Things that flip upside down and right side up and left to right become all one thing to Satan. Being an occupational therapist, I found that kind of disturbing when I was dealing with children with dyslexia because they can't do it either. And certain types of strokes cause people problems with perceptions like that. And that whole big lead up is for a Republican by the name of Phil Gramm in 1999 set out to gather supporters to repeal the Glass-Steagall Act. And he succeeded. The very next year, Phil Gramm came up with a bill, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which was signed into law by Bill Clinton, who's a Democrat and is supposed to represent the common man, the people. It prohibited regulation of derivatives. Derivatives are financial instruments that are kind of sketchy. If a whole lot of people have their houses foreclosed, you can sell that debt. It's a derivative. Speculation and just wild investments using other people's money ensued again. And think about like where you work, somebody taking the payroll and going to the casino and playing backgammon or roulette or poker with it. It used to be illegal, and rightly so. So by the time 2007 comes around, we have a whole lot of paper floating around that's worthless. And people's pension plans and their 401ks, which I don't think existed in that name yet, but there were IRAs, individual retirement accounts. A whole lot of those were worthless paper. And there was a crash. And in 2008, which is 11 years ago, there was the Great Recession. Tens of thousands of people lost their jobs. It was sort of like the hostile takeovers in the 80s, where viable companies were bought up by bigger companies that drained off the capital and shut down the factories. And if they opened any factory at all, they opened it in Bangladesh or Mexico or Taiwan or later China. And so American jobs went overseas, partly because American employers hated the unions because unions wanted a living wage. Unions wanted retirement plans and health care coverage. There's a guy by the name of Matt, and I can't pronounce this, Taibbi, who wrote Secrets and Lies of the Bailout in the Rolling Stone. It's an article. And he was an investment broker. And he does an expose of the fact that banks were secretly borrowing from the Federal Reserve to stay solvent. And because it was secret, nobody knew how much paper these banks were floating. You wouldn't have been approved for a mortgage if you couldn't afford it, and yet these banks that were on the verge of collapse were able to borrow money from the government. And people think that the bailout was $700 billion and that it was a one-time thing under President Obama and that it's now over, which none of that is true. It started before Obama ever got into office, and it's still going on in June in 2019. There was a one-time audit of the Federal Reserve done in November 2011. The news agency Bloomberg took the Federal Reserve to Superior Court for a Freedom of Information Act. And people found out about the secret loans. The bank's too big to fail. There's a cool word for that. Oligopoly. Oligopoly. I got to thinking about why is it that the 12 largest banks in the world control 70% of all bank assets. In the old days, that would have been called a monopoly. The Dodd-Frank laws tried to save the United States citizenry from abuse by the banking industry. They had a Volcker rule, but the ability to exchange derivatives, your failed car loan, your bad credit card debt at Target or Marshall's, TJ Maxx, wherever, could be sold. That debt can be sold. Derivatives. They were returned in an emergency funding bill to fund the government. You know how we have these government shutdowns? We won't give you the money unless you increase the salary for Congress, unless you put a second layer of gold plating on Congress's health care insurance. But when Barack Obama tried to pick up the torch from our own Ted Kennedy and get what is now being called Medicare for all, so that every citizen of the United States has at least basic health care coverage, the Congress twisted that around and twisted that around, like 666 becoming 999, and all American citizens were coerced to buy health insurance from private companies who make a profit from people suffering. Suffering from what? Well, emphysema, because cigarettes were aggressively marketed for decades. Or diabetes, because sugar was aggressively marketed and added to all foodstuffs. I go to Market Basket, I walk down this aisle, it's nothing but drinks. I talked to you before about Canada Dry, Coca-Cola, and PepsiCo getting a lobby together to lobby Congress to put a minimum amount of chlorine, which is a poison, by the way, into all drinking water to make it taste nasty so they could sell more soda, which had sugar in it, which made the American Dental Association go crazy because everybody got cavities in their teeth. And I told you I was a Coca-Cola-aholic. I loved Coca-Cola. And it made me fat, and it rotted out my teeth. And I'm not the only one. But we used to have consumer protection agencies so that you didn't buy a bottle of ginger powder only to find out that it didn't taste like anything because it was salvaged from the making of ginger beer. This happened to my grandmother prior to the enactment of consumer protection laws. One of the people that I was reading about the banking industry and all this stuff going on with our finances called it a perversion of capitalism and a clear and present danger. You know, Barbara Walters is still alive. But a whole lot of people get their news from people like John Oliver and Trevor Noah because they're funny. And the news is so bad, so often, that people need a little humor just to gag it down. I have a friend who thinks that he's developing a psychiatric condition because he used to read 3 papers and listen to the news in the morning and the evening, and he can't. There's so much scuttlebutt about POTUS 45. Welcoming foreign investment into the elections. Oi. Why is that a bad idea? Think about it. Why would foreign governments, especially those hostile to the United States, invest in our elections? So that they could own the candidates that they put into office and say, you need to do this because I helped get you here. It's extortion. We're opening up our electoral process to extortion. I'm going to give you a couple more factoids and then quit this because I find this disturbing and upsetting, so I brought other stuff for you. But I think it's important for you to know that J.P. Morgan, Citigroup, Bank of America, which is not an American company, Wells Fargo, and U.S. Bank Corp. In the United States own 52% of all U.S. deposits. Most of those are direct deposits from employers to the banks so that you no longer get a paycheck, so that every payday, whether it's once a week, every other week, or once a month, you get to choose what bank you go to. No, it's direct deposits, and that was foisted on us with a big lie that little old ladies going to their mailbox were banged over their head by black people who stole their Social Security checks, and that's why your check needs to be direct deposited. Number one, in those days, tellers knew their customers, and they're not going to pay a Social Security check out to someone unless they have identification. What, did the thief go in the house, find the lady's purse, and get her ID to go to the bank to cash the check? And why was it a black person? Well, they were fictitious. Just like the rolls of double voters that excluded thousands of Americans from voting because they had Oriental surnames, Latino surnames, or traditionally black surnames. There's big issues with our electoral process. And we see the president tap dancing. People are being held in contempt of Congress. The day before these documents are due, when there was a 2-month lead up, that he could have used those executive privileges. It reminds me of the Bill and Monica thing. How many presidents have had affairs? I don't even want to think about it. But Bill, they attempted to impeach him by stealing his girlfriend's phone because they were having telephone sex. What is? They were having 800 number sex just privately. I don't condone that, but I mean, it's pretty harmless. You're not going to get AIDS. You're not going to get pregnant. I don't know what their personal relationship was, but the evidence was on the phone that was switched by Linda Tripp. That's entrapment. And wiretap evidence was not accepted in 38 states at that time. And yet now, in 2019, this call may be recorded for training purposes. Who are they training for what? And why are they recording all my calls? If I have a phone message on my iPhone in 2019, I can't delete it until it's been recorded. There's no little message about that, is there? And yet, who's making the iPhones? The Chinese. That's interesting. In the old days, there used to be colored lines on maps and globes that separated countries and states. Now with satellite photography, it's the blue marble. My husband's in the Army, and the armed forces are there to protect us from threat. Threat used to be gross. It was a sword through your stomach. Later on, it was a bullet to your head. It could also be false incarceration with torture, or starvation, or letting people die of thirst. Way back in Egypt, if people were mad at the pharaoh, they'd seal him in the tomb and cut off his air supply so he suffocated, because there were laws against stabbing or hurting or poisoning a pharaoh. So they suffocated him. And since it was something subtle and there was no injury, people didn't understand how they died. I can remember when I was at Boston University getting my occupational therapy degree, we were taught to call a stroke a cerebral vascular accident, because that's what it is. A blood vessel's either occluded or it has an aneurysm and it bursts and it hemorrhages. But way back in Bible days, people had strokes. And they were called strokes because with no wound, the person was suddenly paralyzed on one side and couldn't speak or couldn't sing and navigate, depending which side of the body it was. And so the ancients called that catastrophe a stroke of God, which is where we get the term stroke. And the American Occupational Therapy Association tried to get that language changed because it put a terrible stigma on the poor person who ate too much meat or fish or fatty food and developed plaques in their arteries. Nowadays, the big culprit is sugar and saturated fats, hydrogenated palm oil, that kind of thing. Why are we ingesting that? Because it extends the shelf life of products in grocery stores. In the old days, prior to refrigeration, people salted or sugared food to preserve it. I recently went to the Second Glance's vintage sale, and I bought this beautiful box. It's a humidor. Now, I hate cigars, and I hate cigar smoke. So why would I buy a humidor for $80, no less? It was my way to feed someone at the open door or the food pantry. Why are people at the open door and the food pantry? Goldman, Wichita and Wells Fargo and Citigroup secretly borrowed $7 trillion from the Federal Reserve. Chase is a big borrower too. You can go online and they'll show you which banks owe the federal government money and how much have they paid and how much do they still owe. And yet their CEOs have yachts and million-dollar homes. Although when you think of my house, that's only double my house. And some of the people want to make corporate executive officers criminally liable when they do things that cause people to go bankrupt and lose their homes. The average credit card debt per household in America is $8,286. That doesn't sound like all that much, but it's quite a bit, especially since the average interest rate is like 15%, and it goes up to like 30 if you're poor or black or Latino. Then you can get a payday loan at 25% interest. This is usury. There used to be laws in Massachusetts to protect us. They were overturned. Why? Somebody got their palm greased. That's an old expression for bribery. Total household debt in the United States is $12.85 trillion with a T. I can't even fathom that number. $1 trillion. The debt is now $1.057 trillion, and it exceeds the pre-recession $1.02 trillion debt. If you owe too much, it collapses. Yeah, you can borrow a bit, but you have to be able to pay it back. In 1985, so that's like, well, think about it. That's a while ago. Credit card debt was around 9%. In 2018, it was 15%. Interest buys you nothing. It makes bankers rich. So I showed you last time that I have been working on creative strength training. And I also had a book about collages. And I was taking a collage course with Elizabeth Hardy at the Rockport High School. I got to chapter 8 in that book, Creative Strength Training, and it's an illustration out of Alice in Wonderland with a hookah smoking caterpillar. She says, each of us is fascinating. The who, what, when, why, and how. When I was a kid, it used to be who, where, when, and why. Things change. I've also been working on physical strength training. I went to the Sterling Y in Beverly, and I'm coming back home, and this guy hops the median barrier and pulls a K-turn on the on-ramp. Now, I have a Buddha in my car to try to help me with road rage. I didn't even get angry. I put on the brake, threw my hands in the air, and the guy behind me saw what was going on, and he put on his brake. Well, this idiot pulls a K-turn on an on-ramp to 128. I expect if you're manipulating 2 tons of metal at 55 miles an hour and frequently faster than that, that you would be sober and you would follow traffic regulations. I'm in Rockport, going down Beach Street. People are riding the crest of the road at 35 miles an hour coming at me. It's a two-way road. There's nowhere for me to go if I don't want to land in a little breakfast place or crash into the new whale at the Millbrook Park. People need to get a grip that propriety, nicety, manners are important, because otherwise we regress down to a dog-eat-dog world. What's that about? If you leave dogs loose on the street and they're starving, they'll kill the smallest, weakest member and eat them if they have to. If we do that, it's called cannibalism. I look at what the banks are doing to the American people, and it's a form of cannibalism. So, thinking about cannibalism, I'm at the vintage sale at the Second Glance, and I get Betty Crocker's picture cookbook, and I start going through it. I was not fully aware of the amount of condescension women were placed under in the 50s. I mean, I heard my grandma and my auntie and my mom griping about it, but I'm here reading this book going, oh my goodness, the patronizing condescension in this cookbook. Some of the recipes are great, but I was like, what? I got another cookbook. Our friends took us to the Chalandou to see a movie about Monet. And knowing that was coming, I was in the Second Glance before the vintage sale, and I saw this book, Monet's Palette. And it's a cookbook based on the colors of food and the presentation of food. And it was an interesting film, a little slow-paced for Americans. A lot of talking heads, people walking through fields or being on a houseboat and talking about Monet's life. And I gave that as a thank you gift to my friends for taking us to this lovely movie. And then I found Monet's house. Now, I haven't gotten all the way through this yet, but it's pictures of the inside of his house, the kinds of foods he would have eaten, what his gardens were like. It's kind of neat. It was a very interesting serendipity for me. So this is the collage that I made for the class, and I'm still working on it. One of my classmates said, "Isn't it illegal to cut up money?" I cut up $7 bills, and I made this collage about poverty and despair being a brown phenomena, and the bank bailout based on mean, greedy lies being a red phenomena, and hunger and homelessness rising as a white phenomena. And I cut up $1 and I wrote, "No apathy or cowardice." And I had a T, you know how I like fortunes, I had a T tag fortune. "Your choice will change the world." And then I did a bit of origami with Federal Reserve note, and I wrote vote. I wrote in fine print matters, but also that 1 + 1 = 3. There's a scandalous, famous painting in Paris. It's of a very realistic set of women's genitals. And underneath it says, the foundation of the world. Because at that time, without women, there would be no new humans. We went to the Museum of Fine Art, and my husband, as a gift that I asked for, so it's not his fault, bought me Louis Sherry chocolates that are made in New York from French recipes. And there were 12 gourmet chocolates in this expensive little box. And I shared 6 of them, and then later, and that day, I ate 6 of them. I got on the scale this morning. I regained 6 pounds. Calorie theory does not explain that. But the case against sugar does. It's important to know, if you're losing weight, that all of your fat cells still exist. They shrink, they give up their oil into your bloodstream, and you use it or you excrete it. But the fat cells still exist. And if you eat sugar or you drink alcohol, your pancreas secretes insulin, and your liver attempts to break down the sugar and the alcohol. And insulin turns blood sugar into fat that hungry fat cells absorb immediately. We're starving, give that to us. Which is where belly fat comes from. You've heard the expression beer belly. That's what's happening. So we went to see the Frida Kahlo exhibit. I like the MFA. I'd like to say it was a wonderful show. Go see it. Diego Rivera sequestered Frida's medical enema equipment and stuff in a bathroom and locked it away for 50 years. And it's on display in a room. Black and white photos of her corsets to support her spine after the polio and her bus accident. There's a couple of little paintings, and 2 of them were rejected by the patrons. There are paintings by other people, but I went to see Frida's work. And instead, I saw what for me as an OT was a violation of her medical privacy. She had a back injury. She had to take enemas in order to go to the bathroom. She couldn't go on her own. She had a back injury. And they're displaying her enemas in her bathroom as a big show at the MFA. It was a violation of my expectations. So sometimes I do a thing called bibliomancy. And I opened the Instant Karma book to allow everything to be as it is. We're going to talk about that and why that might not be the best approach on the next episode of Marjohn's Musings.
rose so tall over every crossroads town. There were jobs for one and all. The politicians couldn't wait to shake each calloused hand by the midnight factory gate, praising the working woman and man who will speak for me, who will speak for you, who will stand for me, who will stand for you.